Welcome to the next video in a series that I might actually complete, a top 10 list of the members of Clan Brujah from Vampire the Masquerade. The Brujah get a bad rap, not completely undeserved, as being rebels without a cause, anarchists, and vampires who just break things with no plans on how to fix things. Again, there is some truth to the stereotype, but the Brujah, like the Assamites, have a little more depth than the stereotype, which hopefully will be captured in this selection of Brujah luminaries. So without further ado, let's get into it. Number 10. Menele. Menele, or Menelaus, is the archetypal pre-rabble Brujah, warrior and philosopher in equal measure, and fanatically committed to his vision of how the world ought to be. The name Menelaus ought to be familiar as one of the central figures of the Trojan War, though this is the world of darkness, so events differ slightly from in our own world. As in Homer's epic poem, Menele was a king in what would eventually become Sparta in the 13th century BC. This is 2 centuries before the lawgiver Lycurgus created what would develop into the militaristic city-state of Sparta you may be more familiar with. Anyway, Menele was minding his own business and ruling his own people when he made the acquaintance of a certain woman, or man, depending on your interpretation of vampire lore. That was the second antediluvian of Clan Brujah, Trolley, recently arrived from the second city. Trolley was intrigued by Menele, who had a sharp mind, and invited him to his or her or their haven. They would converse for many months on various subjects of interest to the antediluvian, and Menele was more than a match for their immortal and labyrinthine mind. After this long-running exchange, Trolley judged Menele to be worthy of the embrace, and turned him into a vampire. What Menele did with his newfound immortality is unclear. Perhaps he continued to rule his people. Perhaps he took up his sire's habit of wandering around the world. In his wandering, a fellow Brujah named Altamira of Iberia, who told Menele that the antediluvian had taken up residence on the north coast of Africa, in a new city called Carthage, where it was attempting to build a civilization where Cainites and mortals could live together in harmony, a third city of sorts, to replace the fallen second city of the antediluvians. Menele followed Altamira to Carthage and was so impressed by what he saw that he made Carthage his home. However, the road called to Menele again, but now his travels were not just for experience or knowledge, but as Carthage's unofficial diplomat. Menele was not present to see Carthage descend into infernalism and madness. All he knew was that Rome had marshaled its legions against his home, backed by the Ventru and the Malkavians. Rather than return to defend the city in person, Menele sought alliances with the Nosferatu and Gangrel to counter the Ventru and Malkavians. When Carthage fell, Menele's sorrow was quickly transformed into wrath as he learned who was responsible for the city's destruction, the Toreador, Helena. Again, if you're familiar with the Trojan War, Menelaus and Helen will be very familiar names. Anyway, Helena cut a deal with the Ventru whereby she revealed the weaknesses in Carthage's defenses in exchange for safe passage out of Carthage. Menele swore vengeance on Helena and spent the next 2 centuries chasing her around the ancient world until he finally caught up with her in her Roman resort town of Pompeii in 79 AD. Yes, that Pompeii. Now, Menele had not frenzied in over 1,000 years. For a Brujah, this is like walking around with one caught in the chamber. He released his fury on Pompeii, which was Helena's fiefdom at the time. In the course of his journeys, Menele had learned blood magic, and on that day he enacted a thaumaturgical ritual that released a spirit of fire that had been trapped in Mount Vesuvius. The results were spectacular, as was the devastation. Archaeologists might want to thank Menele for his preserving the city and its residents for future study. The 12,000 or so residents who died roasting in their own flesh and choking on ash might disagree. Menele himself only survived the conflagration by jumping into the harbor and going into torpor. Now it was Helena's turn to swear bloody vengeance against Menele. For 13 centuries, Helena hounded Menele all over Europe. Finally, in 1415 AD, Menele's mortal retainers loaded his torpid body on a ship bound for the New World, which Menele knew thanks to legends from ancient Phoenician sailors. Menele landed somewhere in South America, where he manipulated the mortal tribes on the western coast of the continent to form the Incan Empire, in the hopes of building a new Carthage in the New World with a mortal army to fight against Helena. Helena discovered where Menele had gone to, and in 1532 she arrived in what would become modern-day Peru with Francisco Pizarro and his conquistadors. As disease and treachery tore apart the Incan Empire, Menele fled to North America and hid himself among the Native American tribes, where he eventually came to be known as the Pale Wolf. He even managed to broker a fragile peace with the native Lupine tribes who agreed to let him be. However, in 1812, during the Battle of Fort Dearborn, on the site of the present-day Chicago, the two Methuselahs met for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. Their battle drove them both into torpor, where Menele has remained ever since, while the city of Chicago grew up around him. Menele remains in torpor, though his spirit is aware and active in the events going on around him. He can still use his powerful disciplines even in torpor, and has developed an impressive network of servants and agents who keep him apprised of Helena's activities in the city. In 1993, Menele managed to arouse his Lupine allies to attack the Succubus Club, haven of the newly arisen Helena. The attack killed Helena's first and most beloved ghoul, Prius, the former prince of Troy. And so, their deadly game of cat and mouse, the chess match of ancient vampires played through pawns, puppets, and cat's paws, continues until one or the other meets final death. Number 9. Patricia Bolingbroke. If Menele is the archetypal warrior-philosopher of Clan Brujah, Patricia Bolingbroke, also known as Tyler, is the exemplar of the Brujah reputation of a rebel with or without a cause. Patricia Bolingbroke was born in England in 1352 AD, an otherwise unremarkable daughter of peasants. However, one day her husband was murdered by the baron who held fief over their lands. The newly made widow Patricia, consumed by grief and anger, joined the peasant revolt of 1381, led by the Kentish Wat Tyler, a tax revolt at the start that quickly captured the popular discontents of the time. Bolingbroke was one of the peasants who had dragged Simon Sudsbury, the Archbishop of Canterbury, from the Tower of London and beheaded him. At some point in the short-lived rebellion, she and Wat Tyler became lovers. After he was captured and beheaded by William Walsworth, the mayor of London, Bolingbroke, along with many of Wat Tyler's confederates, was captured and imprisoned, to be executed at the king's pleasure. As Bolingbroke sat in prison awaiting death, death came to find her, specifically in the form of a Brujah named Robin Leland, the self-styled Prince of Nottingham, and occasionally called Robin Hood. Leland admired her zeal and offered her an escape from the headman's axe so that she could continue fighting for freedom. Leland embraced Bolingbroke that very night, and the two escaped from England, but not before Bolingbroke paid a visit to the baron who had murdered her husband and tore him to pieces. Bolingbroke was one of the founding members of the Anarch Revolt, specifically of the Brujah wing of the Anarch Revolt. Bolingbroke at the time was a leader within the clan, and was infuriated by the elders sacrificing their children to the Inquisition in order to save their own skins. She was invited to a meeting of elders in Spain in 1394 AD, where she called for open war against the Inquisition. The Ventrue elder Hardestat the Elder overruled her, counseling that vampires should enact, across the entire continent, the same policy that he enforced in his own fief, which consisted of the entirety of the Holy Roman Empire, a policy of secrecy, of ruling from the shadows and through proxies, the masquerade. Bolingbroke was outraged, and the next night she marched on the castle with a coterie of Brujah. While her own forces were nearly wiped out, she succeeded in diablerizing Hardestat the Elder. Or, so she thought. Word of Hardestat the Elder's death was suppressed. Bolingbroke discovered that the diablerie had made her more powerful and became one of the leaders of the Anarch Revolt. Yet, as the elders pooled their resources and reached across clan lines to form an alliance that would eventually become the Camarilla, Bolingbroke saw her revolt fall to the elders' combined might. When the Anarchs were forced to the peace table at the Convention of Thorns in 1493, Bolingbroke stormed into the convention and attempted to assassinate Hardestat the Younger, who was masquerading as his sire. Bolingbroke's assassination attempt failed and she fled, staying one step ahead of the killer sent after her by the Camarilla. After decades of running, she returned to Spain and boarded a ship bound for Cartagena, primary port of Spain's silver trade in the New World. Unfortunately for the arch-rebel, someone was waiting for her. Helena, the ancient foe of Menele, had entrenched herself in the New World and was instantly aware of Bolingbroke as soon as she stepped off of the ship. Helena dominated Bolingbroke into obedience. Helena then reinforced her control over Bolingbroke with the Blood Bond, wielding Bolingbroke as a dagger against her enemies in the New World. The Camarilla became aware of Patricia Bolingbroke, and she was forced to escape to the English colonies on the eastern seaboard of North America. In the colonies that would become the United States, Bolingbroke changed her name to Tyler and laid low. At the beginning of the 20th century, Helena summoned Bolingbroke to Chicago, where Helena still lay in torpor after her battle with Menele at Fort Dearborn. Bolingbroke served as Helena's agent and supported the burgeoning aviation industry. Currently, Bolingbroke completely controls O'Hare International Airport, Chicago Midway, and even the Gary Chicago Airport. As Tyler, Bolingbroke became a member of the Chicago's Primogen, the Council of Elders subordinate to the Camarilla-backed prince of the city. In 1987, at the prodding of Helena, Bolingbroke diablerized the Brujah elder Prosit, grandchild of Menele by way of Critias. Before the Lupine attack on the Succubus Club in 1993, a Sabbat spy approached Bolingbroke and threatened to expose her true identity to the Camarilla if she did not aid them in conquering Chicago. Bolingbroke, rather than participate, fled to New York and found sanctuary with Lombok Ruthven of Clan Tzimisce, one of her former allies during the Anarch Revolt, now a member of the Sabbat. Number 8. Jeremy MacNeil. From the Brujah leader of the first Anarch Revolt to the Brujah leader of the second Anarch Revolt, Jeremy MacNeil was born in Scotland in 1631 AD. MacNeil, even as a young man, was a fierce warrior for his clan, which served Charles I during the English Civil War against the Parliamentarians in their New Model army. MacNeil's skill in battle drew the attention of a wandering Brujah called James the Red, who embraced MacNeil to add his strength to the Brujah. MacNeil attempted to return to his mortal clan, who rejected him and drove him out, cursing him as a servant of the devil. MacNeil spent some time as a mercenary, even going so far as to side with the Irish against the English crown, who he had fought for in life. After a century as a freebooter, the struggles for freedom dampened his ardor. MacNeil traveled to France, where he met the infamous Robin Leland, sire of Patricia Bolingbroke, who was stoking the fires of what would ignite into the French Revolution. Leland and his furores reinvigorated the despondent MacNeil, but it was Leland's then paramour that captured MacNeil's dead heart. Marguerite Foucard, also of Clan Brujah, had in life been a minor noblewoman, an actress, and a demi-mondaine. Though she was with Leland, MacNeil captured her interest and the two became blood-bonded lovers. Leland gracefully bowed out and gave them his blessing when they traveled to America to join the burgeoning revolution in the colonies. MacNeil sided with the American colonists against the British. In the early days, he made the acquaintance of a black and Indian slave in Boston, Crispus Attucks, who was shot down by British soldiers during the Boston Massacre. Marguerite Foucard saved Attucks by embracing him, and then left him with MacNeil while she returned to France. Though she still loved MacNeil, the rustic colonial life quickly lost its charm for her. MacNeil and Attucks fought side by side in the American Revolution. Given MacNeil's ties to Robin Leland, he was less than popular with the American Camarilla, who declared a blood hunt on MacNeil throughout the newly formed United States of America. MacNeil and Attucks parted ways as MacNeil made plans to travel into the unsettled West. MacNeil eventually reached California at the dawn of the 20th century and planted his Brujah posterior in the city of Los Angeles in 1943. This did not sit well, so to speak, with the then Prince of Los Angeles, Don Sebastian Juan Dominguez of Clan Toreador. But the true power of Los Angeles, Don Sebastian's sire, Christopher Houghton, was fascinated by the Scottish rebel and forbade Don Sebastian from harming MacNeil. However, while Christopher was away in Sacramento, Don Sebastian granted Jeremy MacNeil an audience on the pretense of hearing MacNeil's petition on behalf of a group of black and Hispanic anarchs who had been assaulted by a group of Toreador. Don Sebastian heard MacNeil's petition, and when MacNeil was finished, Sebastian insulted MacNeil, denigrated his clan, his Scottish ancestry, the Anarchs, and his weak blood before using his powerful dominate to force MacNeil to abuse himself before the prince, and then to bash his own skull nearly to pieces while Don Sebastian's lackeys looked on in amusement. Once MacNeil was nearly in torpor, Don Sebastian's ghouls stripped him naked and tossed him in a dumpster just before sunrise. MacNeil managed to muster just enough strength to close the lid before the first rays of the sun could burn him to ash. MacNeil spent the entire day slumbering, naked, covered in filth, with the laughs of Don Sebastian and his court ringing in his ears. When night fell, MacNeil dragged himself to the haven of Salvador Garcia, a fellow Brujah, and told him that the prince had ordered him to be beaten, not that he had been dominated to beat himself. The local anarchs were baying for Don Sebastian's blood, but MacNeil, in his greatest act of self-restraint, held them back. They would strike Don Sebastian, to be sure, but only when they were ready. In the following weeks, MacNeil and his allies located and targeted the havens of Don Sebastian and the elders loyal to him. Marguerite Foucard, hearing of MacNeil's beating at the hands of Don Sebastian's men, traveled to Los Angeles to help him in his revolt. On December 21, 1944, the Anarchs attacked. Don Sebastian met final death, though. Let's just say MacNeil didn't get the chance to kill him. The elders who the Anarchs did not destroy fled the city of Los Angeles. The Anarchs moved quickly to do the same in San Diego. MacNeil's forces made it as far north as San Francisco before they were repelled by that city's prince, Vannevar Thomas of Clan Ventru. Jeremy MacNeil became one of the founding fathers of the Anarch Free States. Despite rejecting any official title, he was considered to be the de facto Baron of the city of Los Angeles. MacNeil quickly learned, though, that ruling was neither as simple nor as romantic as rebelling. MacNeil spent the better part of nearly 45 years struggling to hold the Anarchs together with one arm while attempting to repel the Camarilla and the Sabbat with the other. The Anarchs managed to stop a Sabbat invasion from Mexico in 1965 at high cost. However, Jeremy MacNeil would meet his end not at the hands of Cainites, but at the claws of the Kuai Jin, who invaded the West Coast, starting in San Francisco and moving south. Following the betrayals of Salvador Garcia, Louis Fortier, who joined the Kuai Jin, and Terry Kearney, who joined the Camarilla respectively, Jeremy MacNeil fled Los Angeles. Rumors abound as to whether MacNeil and his allies are still hiding in San Jose, or whether they met final death at the hands of the Kuai Jin. For their part, the Kuai Jin insist, rather strongly, that MacNeil is still alive. Their interest, however, in MacNeil's health might only be so that they can continue to frame him for their own attacks against the Camarilla. Number 7. Tara Kearney. From the greatest hero of the Anarch Free States to one of its most infamous traitors. Well, you might call her a traitor, but she has never wavered in her true allegiance to herself. Tara Kearney, as a mortal woman in her late 20s, traveled west with her own family and a group of others to settle the land and prosper in the wide open country. Now, if you've ever played Oregon Trail in grade school, you know it's real easy for your family members to die from starvation, dysentery, cholera, exposure, and whatever other death flags are in that game. Likewise, Tara's mortal family died on the trail west. As her wagon reached the Texas border, she met her sire, who embraced her and tried to instill in her a sense of righteous justice. Yet, Tara was mostly unmoved, the memory of the family she buried with her own hands still fresh in her mind. Tara continued on to El Paso, Texas, where she gathered a coterie of neonates around her, a surrogate family of sorts. For a time she was content. But once the American Civil War began, Tara's new family was torn apart. She had refused to pick sides in the Civil War, but her coterie had no problem with doing so, some for the Union, some for the Confederacy. Tara traveled from El Paso to Dallas as that city grew thanks to rapid industrialization. The local vampires did not take kindly to her entree into their little nest and kept an eye on her. Meanwhile, Tara slowly amassed a fortune. When Jeremy MacNeil launched the Second Anarch Revolt in California, Tara Kearney saw another opportunity. She gathered her brood and traveled to San Diego and worked to oust the elders from the town. At the end of the revolt, she claimed San Diego as her territory, as part of the Anarch Free States, of course. The Anarchs of Los Angeles didn't trust Tara, but as long as she kept things quiet in San Diego and kept the Camarilla and Sabbat out, they saw no reason to roust her. Once again, Tara was in front of the boom and profited richly as San Diego became a hub for the Navy, civilian defense contractors, tourism, and technology. But as the population of mortals rose, so did the population of kindred, and Tara was unexpectedly driven out of San Diego to Oceanside by a rogue gang of anarchs. As the Anarch Free States collapsed from outside attack and internal division, Terra Kearney plotted her return to power, but this time as a prince of the Camarilla rather than as a baron of the Anarch Free States. When Terra reclaimed San Diego, she forswore her previous allegiance to the Anarchs and declared herself Prince of San Diego. The Camarilla was quick to recognize her claim and sent coteries to San Diego to reinforce her, as well as secure a beachhead to retake Los Angeles. The Anarchs condemned Terra as a traitor, but with the Camarilla and the Quaijin breathing down their necks, proverbially, since neither one can actually breathe, the Anarchs were unable to exact retribution on her. Terra was curiously accepting as the Camarilla sent Sebastian Lacroix of Clan Ventru to serve as Prince of Los Angeles. But when Lacroix Tower exploded like a Roman candle and the Quaijin of Chinatown were eviscerated, Terra was quick to step into the void and declare herself Prince of Los Angeles. Rumor has it that Terra's reign did not last long. It is whispered that parties unknown, possibly Anarchs or Camarilla conspirators, flung the ambitious Brujah from the top of a skyscraper to the pavement below, ending her brief reign. Number 6. Jaroslav Pascek. Enough of this Anarch talk, though. Let's get to some proper Camarilla Brujah, and there are few vampires as proper as Jaroslav Pascek, Justicar for Clan Brujah. For those not hip to the various offices of the Camarilla, Justicars are the big swinging dicks of the organization, the senior vice presidents. They go around meting out the Camarilla's justice on anyone who violates the traditions, up to and including princes. Jaroslav Pascek was born in Germany around the 1340s AD. As the son of a Slav and a gypsy woman, let's say that he was in a bad position from the start of his life. His mother abandoned him on the side of a road as soon as he was born. Fortunately, a Franciscan monk found the baby and brought him back to the monastery. And this is the point where you get your filthy minds out of the gutter, because nothing of the sort happened here. Although the monks were pretty generous with the lash, as they felt it was necessary to young Jaroslav's soul to beat the gypsy wickedness out of him. Ah, constant guilt and frequent beatings, the recipe for raising well-adjusted young men. Jaroslav grew to adulthood and believed that he had a mission from God to reform the Christian church, which he saw had grown worldly and decadent, beating that other German radical, Martin Luther, by over a century and a half. Jaroslav, motivated by righteous purpose, preached sanctity and purity to the peasants of northern Germany. Soon, his holy mission had a holy army, as angry peasants under Jaroslav's command set fire to clergy and relics Jaroslav deemed to be false. Now, is this guy supposed to be Martin Luther or Savonarola? Eventually, Jaroslav's holy rampage drew the attention of Jan Berger, a Brujah, who offered Jaroslav a chance to change the world by killing vampires. Jaroslav, viewing the embrace as a form of martyrdom, accepted and joined Clan Brujah in 1371. In his brief century-long career, Jaroslav and his new parish of vampires cut a bloody swath through the kindred of Munich and then northern Germany. Jaroslav was especially harsh in dealing with those kindred who had the audacity to masquerade as priests or angels. When the inner circle formed the Camarilla, Jaroslav viewed the masquerade as the ideal way of curbing the excesses of vampires, and weary of hunting down the enemies of God, Jaroslav found a forgotten Roman crypt to sleep away the ages in. But Jaroslav was gravely mistaken. When he awakened in the 17th century, he fell upon a pack of Sabbat, motivating him to pick up right where he had left off. Jaroslav's new coterie spent the next 200 years waging war on the Sabbat, and did so with such thoroughness and brutality that even the cardinals of the Sabbat knew fear when Jaroslav was rumored to be in the area. The decision was made to bring Jaroslav into the fold of the Camarilla officially, and he was elevated to the position of Archon in 1834, where he served under several Brujah Justicars, including Don Udolfo Cerro de Leon, Dimitra Ilanova, and Karlak. As for Jaroslav's methods, well, let's just say, while he's incredibly thorough as an investigator and evidence gatherer, he has never been shy about extracting information or confessions through the liberal application of physical and psychological torture. In 1998, after Justicar Karlak resigned following the assassination of the Nosferatu Justicar Petrodon, the Inner Circle elected Jaroslav to fill the office. Almost immediately after his appointment to Justicar, Jaroslav, along with his fellow Justicars Lucenda of Clan Ventru and Cock Robin of Clan Nosferatu, commanded the Camarilla forces that retook the city of New York in 1999. Now that New York is back in Camarilla hands, Jaroslav has turned his attention north to Montreal, the oldest Sabbat city in North America. Number 5. Theo Bell. Now we turn from the Brujah Justicar to a Brujah Archon, possibly one of the most famous of all Archons, Theo Bell, also known to the Anarchs and Sabbat unlucky enough to cross his path as Killer B. No anime worshippers, this is long before your beloved Naruto, so calm your tits. Theo Bell won personal acclaim from the inner circle of the Camarilla 7 times for his actions in combat, an unprecedented number for any Archon. Theo Bell was born in antebellum Mississippi under the name Theophilus, which is a Greek name that can be translated to either friend of God or loved by God. Theo Bell was born into slavery, which made for a harsh life, though his father, a large and gentle man, made Theo's young life as happy as he possibly could. But when Theo turned 5, he, along with his mother and half of their family, were sold to a large plantation owner named Bell. It took an adult man to pry Theo's small arms from his father's legs as they both cried. The few vampires Theo has ever confided in, he has told them that that was the first time he had ever seen his father cry, and it was the last time that Theo would ever shed tears. Despite years of searching, both as a mortal and a vampire, Theo never saw his father again. Theo's new master, Bell, was cruel, even by the standards of the time. Theo's mothers and sisters were sufficiently attractive that Master Bell took it as his right and prerogative to satisfy his lusts on them, and get a few mulatto slaves in the process. Theo's helplessness in this situation broke something inside of him that has never been fixed. When Theo came of age, he was as strong and tall as his father, but without any of his father's happiness or laughter. Theo often drew the overseer's whip as he was disobedient and sullen, but at night, Theo dreamed of what it would be like to wrap his hands around Master Bell's neck and squeeze until he felt the little bones crack, just like a chicken's. When Theo's mother died from illness, he fled the Bell plantation after killing an overseer and followed the North Star to freedom. After a journey of several months, he arrived in Ohio, and for several years after, he worked as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, making forays back into the Deep South to liberate what slaves he could. However, success made Theo careless. He had been spotted, wounded, and was on the run from bloodhounds. When he took a quick drink from a stream, he looked back up to see a man, smiling down at him, a white man. Theo lunged for him, hoping to kill him quickly before anyone else caught up, but the man sidestepped Theo and hauled him up into the air by his neck with one hand. It was something that should have been impossible. No human could move like that. No man as modestly built as this white man, who held him in the air immobile, had the strength to stop someone Theo's size. The man calmed Theo, telling him that he was not one of Theo's pursuers, nor was he interested in enslaving Theo once more, at least, not to any master Theo might understand. He introduced himself as Don Udolfo Cerro de Leon, and that he had watched Theo from a distance for some time now. Theo was impressive, but he had reached his limit as a merely mortal man. If Theo would agree, he could offer Theo more, much more. Now Theo, despite his lack of education, remembered old slave tales about things that descended on the slave quarters at night that weren't lecherous masters and overseers, creatures that drank blood from you as you slept. But his fear was soon replaced by the memories of his father, his mother, his sisters, and Master Bell, dead by his hand, with the power that Don Cerro was offering him. Theo relaxed in the Don's grip as a bargain was struck, with one condition. Theo would be permitted to return to the Bell plantation. Theo never lived to see the next dawn. On a black, moonless night, Theo returned to the Bell plantation and snuck into Master Bell's house without so much as a sound. He stood over the fat old slave master with the largest, sharpest whip he could procure coiled in his hand, and with a crack like thunder, he brought the whip down on the sleeping Bell, again and again, harder and faster than any human could imagine. The blood filled the room, the crack of oiled leather, and Master Bell's screams filled Theo's ears as he felt his own blood rising. More red, more screams, more blood. When Theo finally came to his senses, though, he was a distance from Master Bell's house, which had somehow caught fire, the only light other than the stars. To his surprise, he looked around to see that he was in the slave quarters, or at least what was left of it. There were bodies everywhere, some white, but mostly black, staring up at him, silently, at nothing. Among those faces were his sisters and younger brother. He wanted to weep, but he had no tears left in his lifeless body, only blood. As he ran from the plantation, he decided that he would take the name Bell for his own. Theo Bell. He would never forget that he had the ruinous powers of a slave master, but in his heart, he would also never forget that he himself had once been a slave. Don Cero had received an education as a gentleman in his native Spain, and decided that Theo should likewise be educated. Don Cero personally taught Theo history, philosophy, letters and languages, as well as the lore of kindred. Theo took to Don Cero's lessons eagerly and surpassed his sire's expectations as both a scholar and a warrior. To sharpen his new vampiric gifts and to erase the memory of his murdered family, he engaged in rescue missions on other plantations and made raids against Confederate supply depots. At the end of the American Civil War, Don Cero and Theo Bell boarded a ship for Europe to make a tour of the capitals and courts of the Old World. Theo Bell enjoyed a minor celebrity while he was in Europe, both as a child of a respected vampire and as a curiosity. Now, to be sure, the concept of African vampires was not unknown, though most of the vampires of Europe had never actually seen one. But, to their knowledge, no one had ever embraced one of the slave population from the Americas. Theo endured the patronizing questions, the half-hidden mockeries, and the solicitations to sample his exotic Negro blood for the sake of Don Cero, who, in their travels and viewing of all the major mortal cultures of Europe, had become something of a surrogate father to him. But in his fellow kindred, he saw something disturbingly similar to the debauchery and indifference to human life that he had experienced on Master Bell's plantation. Now, this is where I point out a minor lore contradiction. Supposedly Don Cero becomes the Brujah Justicar in the 1950s. This is done because Cero has contacts in the American Civil Rights Movement that can counter Anarch influence, and the Inner Circle wants Theo as an Archon. However, other lore states that Dimitra Ilanova was the Brujah Justicar from 1946 to 1972, which is how Karlach becomes an Archon and subsequent Brujah Justicar from 1972 to 1997. But who cares? Anyway, Theo Bell is an Archon, though he resents the politics behind the appointment and sympathizes with the Anarch cause. This doesn't stop him from executing Camarilla justice on them and the Sabbat. By the 1990s, Theo Bell was the most feared Archon in the United States, having received the aforementioned commendations from the Inner Circle. He was so effective that when his fellow Archon, Jaroslav Pascek, received the Justicar post, he retained Theo as an Archon, despite the two hating each other. They even worked together during the Battle of New York in 1999, when Jaroslav commanded the battle from above while Theo led the forces on the ground that chased Archbishop Polonia and the rest of the Sabbat out of Manhattan. Number 4. Pierre Bellemare. Since we're on the subject of the Sabbat, let's discuss some Brujah who actually served the Sword of Cain, the Brujah Anti-Tribune. And what better place to start than in the Sabbat's greatest North American stronghold, with one of their greatest warriors, Pierre Bellemare, except he's not one of the Sabbat's greatest warriors. Kind of. Well, make no mistake, he is probably as dangerous, if not more so, than the previously discussed Theo Bell, but his loyalties to the Sabbat are not what they should be. Pierre was born in Montreal, Canada at the turn of the 20th century. In 1922, he survived an epidemic of smallpox, but only after praying, with all of his black heart, that the disease took his family instead of him. And his request was granted. His family died, but he recovered. Now before you chalk it up to the big man upstairs, look just a little bit closer to the ground. Beneath Montreal is bound a demon by the name of Metathiax, one of the Decani. Now I hear you saying, what the hell is a Metathiax or a Decani? Well, the Decani are a group of 36 plague demons that the Bali call upon, the Bali being the bloodline of demon-worshipping vampires in the setting. to make life unpleasant for anyone and everyone. The Decani are, in fact, simply facets of a greater demon called Namtaru, the spreader of plagues. But this is not a Clan Bali video, and I'm not going to set this to the age-appropriate level of a Clan Bali video, so we're not even going to head down that particular primrose path. But I will point out that the last time one of the Decani got loose, the Black Plague happened. Yeah, these guys are kind of serious business. So how does a plague demon wind up stuck under Montreal? Here's the short version. Mathathiax was just minding his own business, trying to desecrate some ground sacred to the Huron tribe, when said tribe buried him under the mountain and kept him there. What a bunch of jerks, right? Anyway, back to Pierre. 5 years later, in 1927, the Sabbat do what they do best. They snatched up Pierre and performed the creation rites on him. Now, creation rites for the Sabbat is kind of like the Embrace, except they crack you over the head with a shovel and then bury you under the ground, because the best way to kill humanity is to inflict brain damage on the recruits. Unfortunately, they performed the creation rites right where old Mathathiax was buried. Now, while Pierre is buried under the ground, he and Mathathiax have a heart-to-heart. The demon saved Pierre once and is willing to do so again, and not only that, but give him lots of demonic goodies and powers. In exchange, Pierre will work very hard to get Mathathiax out of his earthly prison, so that he can give the gift of plague to the entire world. Pierre thought this was a sound arrangement and agreed. So, Pierre Bellemare has been an Infernalist, corrupted, not an agent of the Sabbat, but an agent of demons, pretty much since the get-go. Now, Pierre has carefully cultivated the image and reputation of your stereotypical Sabbat Brujah, which is to say that every problem can be solved with generous applications of brute force and ignorance. However, this is a cover for a hellishly manipulative mind. Everyone who has gotten in Pierre's way has come to some unfortunate end that can't be traced back to him. His own sire, Louis Le Monstre, founder of the Les Orphelins pack, somehow fell into a Camarilla trap in 1939 that Pierre himself, by some miracle, escaped. Since the death of his sire, Pierre, as the leader of the Les Orphelins pack, has worked to sow discord and chaos between the Sabbat packs of Montreal and to encourage infighting between the Sabbat bishops. At the top of his list of Sabbat vampires to screw over are the Shepherds of Cain pack, the oldest and most respected pack in Montreal, and the only force in Montreal with the power and lore capable of harming Mathathiax, if they were to become aware of the demon's existence. When the previous Archbishop of Montreal, Sangris, was subjected to a Sabbat inquisition and convicted of infernalism, Pierre Bellemare came under suspicion, but was cleared. Since then, Pierre has worked through more proxies, establishing cults of corruption in the city as a vector for spreading the diseases in his blood to the mortal population. Nice things, like smallpox, diphtheria, cholera, and hepatitis. A veritable typhoid Mary with a gun, this guy. Number 3. Jayne Jonestown. I didn't think much of this character when I first read about him, but later I kind of appreciated the effort of White Wolf to take the piss out of a certain overly vocal and goth segment of their own fanbase, with a character who is totally not a riff on Marilyn Manson and the vampire Lestat. The boy who would come to be Jayne Jonestown was born somewhere in the American Midwest, the first dozen years of his life marked by practically non-existent parenting. And what's the best way of dealing with a wild kid? Take him down to live in a double-wide trailer in the Florida swamps. Jayne Jonestown retreated into the world of his own imagination, of drugs, role-playing, and pseudo-Satanism. Ignored by his parents and bullied by his peers, he struggled in education, except for literature and writing. His works, however, while creative, tended to turn perverse and morbid as his personal life collapsed around him. But everything changed for him when he met a fellow outcast at a hole-in-the-wall goth club. The two formed a band, shocker, teen outcasts making a band, creatively named Jayne Jonestown and the Graveyard Skullfuckers. Their musical stylings were juvenile interpretations of death metal and industrial, meaning that they generously abused instruments and screamed loudly into microphones. Jayne added some of his own theatrical touch to their performances that gained them local infamy, such as putting women in cages, overt sex acts on stage, and the occasional eating of feces. Naturally, this appealed to all of the other edgy teens in town who felt the need to assert their independence by shocking the parental units, and before long, Jayne had a following. Jayne hired a couple other musicians to round out their sound and rented a van, then took their act on the road. He would become the new symbol of youthful rebellion for the alienated youths of America. Now, Jayne Jonestown rose to fame the way any great musician in America does, by ripping off more talented musicians. His first taste of fame was by doing a cover of David Bowie's Heroes with his own overwrought and spooky style. The cover got spins on radio rock stations around the country, while his merchandise flew off the table at his shows. Parents were positively shook as their precocious teenagers gallivanted around the house with shirts that read, "Eat your parents," and "My evil knows no bounds." Now, I know some of you still have those Darkthrone shirts at home, or in your parents' attics. Don't you dare lie about it. Among Jayne's newly minted legion of angsty youths were a few vampires. Some of them actually took the whole thing seriously, because what's the fun of being Sabbat if you can't bask in edginess, right? But the wiser heads saw it for what it was, a criticism of mortal society and values, which they appreciated. One Brujah anti-tribu, named Warren Bryant, appreciated it so much that after one of Jayne's shows had been shut down in Miami by the police, he managed to corner Jayne and give him the embrace. Since his embrace, Jayne produced his greatest album, Satanophile, an operatic offering laden with ironic jabs at the dark side of the unexamined life. However, Jayne has made some new friends since his embrace. Those friends are members of the Society of Leopold, the vampire hunting branch of the Catholic Church. Now, why would any vampire be friends with an inquisitor? It should go without saying that Jayne has not revealed himself to them as a vampire, but he has somehow managed to convince them that his music is an excellent way to expose vampires, cultists, and other heretics for their unique brand of attention. Now, Jayne Jonestown's latest album, The Soul Menagerie, has put him directly in the Camarilla's crosshairs, as he has aimed his usual bombast and irreverence for consumerism and media, but also he added several tracks dedicated to the hypocrisies of what could easily be identified as vampire society. He's all but guaranteed that some ambitious Archon is going to take a shot at him, or possibly that the Camarilla will put him on the red list. But his celebrity combined with the masquerade itself protects him, at least to a point. Most of his fans think that his vampire shtick is just an act, a criticism of the music industry and the press. As for Jayne, well, he just thinks it's fun pissing off the Camarilla. Meanwhile, he lives like a rock star. He does the interviews, the pressers, scares the shit out of the normal people, draws attention, and sucks blood from the necks of drug-addled groupies in order to get high. He also occasionally simulates sex just to keep up appearances, because rock stars have to fuck groupies. However, Jayne is walking a dangerous line between the Inquisition and the Camarilla. But then again, falling off the edge might just be the ultimate thrill for him. Ecaterina the Wise. This brings us to another Brujah who has a long history of provocation and agitation, the agitator of Prague herself, one of the last of the Brujah Prometheans, Ecaterina the Wise. Ecaterina was born in the 12th century in Central Europe. Her first brush with the nocturnal world of vampires was when two mercenaries in the pay of Clan Ventru attempted to rape her in the streets of Prague, but only succeeded in mutilating the lower half of her face as she resisted them. Her rescuer and sire, Marhuel, did what he could to repair the damage, but she bore the scars of that attack even after he embraced her in 1141 AD. Ecaterina was always small, given that she was embraced in her mid-teens, but her stature belied her ferocity and her force of personality, and her willingness to take on the Ventru Prince of Prague. This elevated her stature with the Brujah and the kindred of Prague. However, her attempts to get the Ventru Prince deposed failed, as Rupert was too valuable to the Primacilids who ruled Prague, the same Primacils who were revenants of Clan Zamitzi. Following the fall of Visegrad Castle, Ecaterina fled Prague and joined the Anarch Revolt, along with her fellow Brujah rebels in pursuing freedom from the tyranny of the Elders. When she learned of the Convention of Thorns and how many of her fellow Anarchs had bent the knee to the Camarilla, she was infuriated, joining the Sabbat to continue the fight for freedom. With time, the Camarilla pursued the Sabbat out of most of Europe, and Ecaterina was one of the first Sabbat to make the journey to the New World, making her haven in New York City. Her contributions were recognized and she earned the title of Bishop of the Sabbat. However, in time, the sect came to disappoint her. The Sabbat civil wars, the dominance of the Tzimisce, the La Sombra, and the Assamite anti-tribu gave the appearance that the Sabbat was merely a vehicle for clan politics, and that the domination of neonates and ancilla by elders had simply taken another form. Her frustrations came to a head during Apala Grande, the most important gathering for the Sabbat in any city during the year. Some fledgling challenged Ecaterina to a monomacy duel for her title as bishop. She was well within her rights to refuse the challenge, given her status and power. Yet the assembled Sabbat dared to mock her for refusing. When she looked to Archbishop Polonia for support, he simply shrugged. The mob wanted blood, so blood she gave them. The duel was over in seconds as Ecaterina hurled the hapless vampire headfirst from an overpass to splatter on the ground below. She turned her fury on the cheering Sabbat, asking them, "Is this all that remains of the great jihad? Are we so sluggish and contented that instead of fighting our holy cause, we fight each other? You are jackals. You are beasts and spoiled fledglings and abortive failures. How any of you can call yourself true Sabbat and not end your unlives with purifying flame, I don't know." And at that moment, the Black Hand attacked. A column of Assamite anti-tribu led by La Sombra emerged from the shadows from behind Ecaterina and struck. The scene quickly descended into chaos as Ecaterina fell to the assassin's blades and poisonous vitae. Yet they could not secure the proof of her death. Her body had been carried off in the press of terrified mortals and vampires. 30 years later, in 1996, Ecaterina woke from torpor, alone in a concrete electrical room in an abandoned subway tunnel, with an empty leather-bound diary as the only clue as to her rescuer. That she managed to survive the Black Hand at all was a miracle in itself. But who had saved her? Who had given her blood to heal herself? Who owned the empty diary? And most importantly, who had been behind the attack? The questions continued to plague Ecaterina as she emerged in a different New York City than the one she had known. Ecaterina did not dare present herself to Polonia. She was uncertain as to whether it was he that ordered the assassination. Instead, she concealed her true age and potency, reinventing herself as Catherine Weiss, an ancilla and loyal member of the Camarilla in exile, recently arrived to help reclaim the city. For the most part, the ruse has worked, bolstered by a few token victories over minor Sabbat pacts that no one would miss. Ecaterina, or Catherine, keeps involved in kindred politics. She no longer concerns herself with securing freedom for vampires, but of ensuring her own survival. If that means that she must throw other vampires to the dogs, so be it. Whatever loyalty she might have held for the Sabbat perished on the swords of the Black Hand over 30 years ago, and she regards her new allegiance to the Camarilla as merely a means to several ends. The first end is to find the identity of her savior and settle that boon as quickly as possible, for Ecaterina cannot stand being in another's debt. Second, to determine who was responsible for the attack on her. It must have been someone powerful to be able to command the Black Hand, but whoever it was, she will make sure that they meet final death, and they will truly suffer before the end. Number 1. Christof Romuald. I started the video with an independent Brujah, so I'll finish with an independent Brujah. The child of Ecaterina the Wise, Christof Romuald, Crusader, Sword Brethren, Promethean, Avenger. Christof was the protagonist of the video game Vampire the Masquerade Redemption, and if the events of the game are taken as accurate, Christof is one of the deadliest vampires to ever exist, having destroyed scores of vampires from clans Cappadocian, Nosferatu, Ventru, La Sombra, Tremere, Setite, Giovanni, and Tzimisce, to say nothing of the mortals and ghouls who have fallen to his sword and fangs. But the ranks of the kindred are filled with deadly warriors. What makes Christof noteworthy is his desperate struggle to find peace in his state as a vampire. Now, there are some minor lore contradictions between the video game and the larger canon of Vampire the Masquerade with respect to the timing of Christof's embrace and the identity of the Tzimisce Methuselah of Prague, but we aren't going to let that get in the way of a good story. Christof was born in France in the 12th century and joined the Order of the Sword in the Crusades. Christof made it as far east as the Moravian Hills, where he was wounded by pagan barbarians, who may or may not have been service to the Tzimisce clan. The Sword Brethren left him to heal at a nunnery in Prague, where Christof met Sister Aneska. While the rest of the convent gave Christof up for dead, Aneska tended to him day and night until he recovered. The pair fell in love, though it was a love that neither could act on, as Christof was pledged to the crusade and Aneska to the church. Christof swore to repay Aneska and the people of Prague by slaying the monsters that had made their nest in the Bond silver mines. Christof slew the deformed, flesh-crafted Schlachta and their mistress, Azra the Unliving, a Tzimisce vampire. The people of Prague called Christof a hero, yet he was troubled by what Azra had sputtered in her final moments, a plot by the Tzimisce to eventually conquer the world. The next night, while Christof patrolled the streets on the orders of Archbishop Giza, who had grown jealous of Aneska's affections for Christof, Premysl revenants, also in service to the Tzimisce, attacked the convent as retribution for the final death of Azra the Unliving. Christof returned just in time to slay the ghouls, but fled out into the night again, fearful that he had put Aneska in danger by his very presence. He met death and damnation that very night, in the form of Ecaterina the Wise, the Promethean Brujah, and his sire. She chose him for the embrace for his strength, and to save his life from the Tzimisce retribution. Christof mourned for what he believed was his damned soul, and went through a crisis of faith. He could not accept that a merciful God would allow vampires to exist, to damn faithful men like him, to prey on the innocent. Christof's faith was replaced by blinding rage that Ecaterina wisely directed against the enemies of the Brujah. When he came to Aneska, to warn her against ever seeking him again, she left the convent to find some means of breaking the curse of Cain, and in doing so fell into the hands of the warlocks of Clan Tremere. Christof's fury couldn't be contained as he and a coterie of vampires loyal to him traveled to the city of Vienna to lay siege to the Tremere chantry itself, battling the Tremere Methuselah Etrius to a standstill until the warlock revealed that Aneska never reached Vienna. The caravan that transported her was waylaid by the Tzimisce from Vyšehrad Castle, the home of the Premysls and Azra's true master, the torpid Methuselah, Vukodlak. Christof returned to Prague and attacked Vyšehrad Castle, fighting his way into the inner sanctum of Vukodlak, only to discover that Aneska had fallen under Vukodlak's sway and had become his ghoul. Vukodlak had plunged into torpor by his fellow Tzimisce voivodes, who feared his plot to diablerize the antediluvians and reign over the world as an immortal and invincible god. As she attempted to raise Vukodlak and the castle crumbled around them, Christof seized Aneska, which resulted in the breaking of the ritual. He was presumed to have met final death as his allies saw him buried beneath tons of falling stone. But they were wrong. In 1999, researchers from the Society of Leopold dug up Christof's torpid body and packed him off to their chapter house in London for study. Before the Inquisitors could secure him, someone awakened him from torpor. Christof fought his way free of the chapter house, where he was met by a world that was almost totally alien to him. As Christof struggled to acclimate himself to the modern world, he was driven by a singular goal: to find and destroy Vukodlak, the hand behind all of the calamities that had befallen him, as a mortal and as a vampire. His hunt for Vukodlak took him from London to New York, where he discovered his ancient enemy had relocated in anticipation of his own resurrection. Christof and his allies descended into Vukodlak's cathedral of flesh to confront the Methuselah once more, newly arisen from torpor. To Christof's shock, Aneska was still alive. It was she who had awakened Christof from torpor, her last, desperate attempt to prevent the mad Tzimisce's return. Aneska, feigning loyalty to Vukodlak, had spent nearly a millennium frustrating his planned resurrection, but now he could no longer be delayed. At the end of the battle, it was Christof who emerged victorious from the cathedral. How Christof and his young coterie managed to defeat an ancient monster as powerful as Vukodlak, only he and his coterie could say. Personally, I say it was flamethrowers. Since his destruction of Vukodlak, Christof has been the subject of wild rumors that he is a prince of the Camarilla, an archbishop of the Sabbat, a member of the Incarnu, that he did not actually destroy Vukodlak at all and is instead under the Methuselah's thrall as a blood-bound servant, that Christof wields the blood-stealing sword of Dracula, that he has found Golconda, or, the wildest rumor of them all, that Christof is somehow a European Kuai-Jin. Yeah, that last one is a little bit of a head-scratcher. I mean, it's not impossible, but it's highly improbable for reasons that would require a whole other video to explain. But Christof eschews sectarian politics. He holds the Sabbat in utter contempt, and he is mostly indifferent to the Camarilla. Finally, he neither claims membership in or knowledge of the Incarnu. He has spent the last 8 centuries caught in the schemes of other vampires. Whatever it is that Christof seeks, he will find it on his own terms, though he might not do so alone. Occasionally, Christof is seen in the company of a beautiful woman, a woman who may or may not be a Nezga. So, that has been my top 10 list of members of Clan Brujah. I tried to do a decent mix of Brujah, some Anarchs, some Independents, some Camarilla, some Sabbat, just to illustrate that the Brujah are kind of all over the place in terms of ideology, and that's kind of the point of the Brujah. They are all driven by some vision of how the world ought to be, and they will do whatever it takes to make the world conform to that vision. The next clan on the list is Gangrel, the Beast Clan, wild on the inside, and occasionally wild on the outside too. Until next time.